Look, I love Ryan. I do. But when I get out of this hospital, I'm gonna kill him. 1 month ago, my old backpacking group decided to get back together for a trek. Our group of 4, consisting of myself, Ryan, Ivan, and Mason, had been going on hikes together since we were in middle school. We've been a close-knit crew for over a decade, but after graduating college, our busy schedules made it difficult for us to get everyone together. When Ryan reached out to the rest of us with a route near Oregon's Willamette National Forest, I was thrilled. Ivan, Mason, and I agreed, and the 4 of us geared up for a trek through a lesser traveler portion of the wilderness ahead, which Ryan referred to as Epiphany Canyon. Here's the real kicker in all of this. That Ryan never even showed up. He canceled on us last minute, leaving the rest of us out to dry thanks to some work thing. I tried asking Mason about it since the 2 of them worked at the same lab, but he didn't seem to know any more than I did. We were naturally a little annoyed, but we'd already prepared for the 7-day trek, and so we decided to just go without Ryan. Ivan, Mason, and I met up in Salem, as we planned, and after a few hours of suffering through Mason's country music playlist, we made it to Epiphany Canyon's unmarked trailhead. Day 1. The first day of travel went without a hitch. My friends were good company, and I was happy to have nothing to do but walk, take photos, and shoot the shit with the 2 of them. The only indication I had that something was faintly off was the frequency with which we encountered trail cameras. The first one I spotted was so well disguised that I thought it was lichen. When I realized what it was, I brought it up with Ivan and Mason immediately. Trail cams, in my experience, often indicated conservation areas or hunting grounds, and I wasn't in the mood to get arrested for trespassing or to get shot. Mason assured me that the trail was safe. Ryan said that he did this trail a few weeks ago. I'm sure he'd have mentioned the hunters. Let's just stick to his path. I let it go, but every time I saw a trail camera after that, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder and scan the tree line for the glint of a barrel. Day 2. In the early morning of our second day on the trail, before the others woke up, I stole away from camp for a while. Alone with my camera, I wandered around until I stumbled upon a small clearing. I looked down at the forest floor, hoping for some interesting flora, and saw a large brown mantis making its way across the ground, marching forward with all the certainty of time itself. When I crouched down to take a picture, it walked fearlessly right across my hiking boots. Amused, I readied my camera, framed the mantis, and the sound filled the clearing, but I hadn't depressed the shutter button yet. I lowered the camera and turned my head towards the source of the sound, expecting a deer. Instead, I saw a person disappear behind a large fir at the end of the clearing. I had caught such a brief glimpse that I wasn't even sure if I'd seen a man or a woman. Startled, I rose to my feet, taking care not to step on the praying mantis. "Hello?" I called out. The person, whoever they were, didn't answer. That is, if I had actually seen someone in the first place. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I hoped that it was because the alternative was a suspicious, potentially ill-intended person out on the trail with us. I waited for a minute, but when I didn't hear or see anything else, I made my way back to camp. It was warmer than the forecast had promised. The tree canopy helped some, but by late afternoon, our trio was exhausted, sweat-drenched, and irritable. At 2 o'clock, we heard the running water, and after a small detour, we found a thin stream that wasn't pictured on our maps. We decided to see where it led, agreeing that if we ever began to stray too far from Ryan's trail, we would return to our charted course. Luckily, the stream kept more or less parallel with the Epiphany Trail, and we followed it for the better part of 2 hours. It slowly grew larger, connecting with another unmarked stream before culminating in a waterfall about 3 meters tall, with a wide plunge pool at the bottom. We hiked our way down to the bottom of the falls, where a newly installed signpost had been hammered into the banks. Gordian Falls, read the signpost, which notably lacked any warnings to stay out of the water. Ivan was quick to strip off his outer layers and charge into the pool. Mason stayed out, opting to take a walk around the area instead of a swim, but I soon joined Ivan in the water. It was surprisingly warm, almost off-puttingly so, yet not quite hot enough to make me think we'd stumbled into a natural hot spring. After ensuring the pool was deep enough, Ivan suggested diving from the stone overhang at the top of the falls. He began to climb up the side of the waterfall, and I would have happily followed him had I not suddenly become aware of a stinging sensation in my foot. I limped out of the water to check if I'd kicked something sharp, and sure enough, there was a cut on the sole of my foot. While annoying, it was small and didn't bleed much, so I patched myself up quickly. I didn't rejoin Ivan in the water, though, not wanting to risk infection. Instead, after warning him to watch out for rocks, I found a spot in the shade to sit and rest as I waited for him to get out. The next thing I knew, although I didn't even remember closing my eyes, I woke up under a dark sky. I sat up quickly and checked my watch, which read 9:30 p.m. Had I really slept for 5 hours straight? Why hadn't the others woken me up? And Mason was sitting beside me, staring at the waterfall. I reached out and gave him a shove, not bothering to hide my annoyance as I questioned him.
What the hell, man? Are you two brain dead? Why'd you let me sleep for so damn long?
Mason looked at me briefly, then redirected his gaze towards Gordian Falls. I followed his eyes and was shocked to see Ivan still in the water, floating on his back. For seconds, I thought he was sleeping, but then he splashed the water gently, propelling his body back towards the center of the plunge pool.
He hasn't been in there this whole time, has he?
I asked. He's come out a few times, but for the most part, yeah. As if he heard us talking about him, Ivan suddenly flipped onto his stomach and swam towards the banks. When he saw us, he got out and staggered over, smacking the side of his head to get water out of his ears as he did.
You good?
I asked him, and he gave me a strange look, part grimace and part glare, before shrugging.
Kinda dizzy. I must have caught too much sun today.
And with that, he dried off and crawled into one of the 3 tents that Mason must have set up for us while I was sleeping. Despite having slept for hours, I too was ready for bed. I figured that Ivan and I had both caught heat exhaustion, which would explain his dizziness and my fatigue. I bade goodnight to Mason and clambered into my tent and fell asleep once more. Day 3. On the 3rd day of our trek, I woke up with a pain in my foot, but not where I'd cut myself. There was a tenderness in my ankle, more akin to a bruise than a cut. Somehow it felt like the pain was behind my bone. I unwrapped my foot to change the bandaging, but the cut looked like it was healing well. No pus, fresh blood, or discoloration. There was, however, some signs of inflammation where my leg met my foot. One of the thin veins near my ankle bone looked darker than normal. I changed my bandage, resolving to keep an eye on it and alert my friends if it got worse. Aside from that, it was a normal, pleasant day. Day 4. It was a sweltering day. When I crawled out of my tent in the morning, Mason and Ivan were already tearing down the tents, and they were doing so with an uncharacteristic taciturnity. Once I packed up, I took a look at Ryan's map. We were behind schedule, but not by much. I looked up, about to air my suggestions for how best to make up for lost time, when something in the distance caught my eye. In the direction we came, standing atop one of the lower ridges of the mountains that framed Epiphany Canyon, was a person. They were so far away that it was difficult to make out any detail, but this time, unlike the stranger in the clearing, I could tell that this person was a man. I could also tell, rather disturbingly, that he was making no visible attempt at ascending or descending the ridge. He was standing completely still, and I was fairly sure that he was staring in our direction. The sight of that distant figure filled me with dread. Though he wasn't doing anything obviously sinister, I suspected that he was the same person who had hidden from me in the clearing. If that was true, my group was being followed. Between him, my foot, and my companion's strange demeanors, I was close to calling it quits and turning around right then and there. But then again, turning around at that point in the trek meant crossing paths with a stranger, which at that point seemed like a bad idea. I stuffed the map into my pocket and summoned Ivan and Mason for a debrief, explaining my suspicions to them. I suggested that we continue our trek as quickly as possible and start sleeping in shifts during the night, ensuring someone was always awake to alert the group of unwanted visitors. Though both had been oddly quiet all morning, they seemed to take my words seriously, agreeing to stay vigilant. We finished packing quickly and left the area soon after. The remainder of the day was productive. We covered enough grounds to make up for day 2, and the sights were the best I'd seen so far. Ivan hung behind Mason and I for most of the day, though he shook his head every time we asked him if something was wrong. When we set up camp that night, he immediately went to sleep, not cracking open a single can of beer with Mason and me.
I can excuse him spacing out, but Ivan not drinking? He must have hit his head jumping into the falls.
Mason laughed in response to my assertion, though his expression was one of concern.
Let's keep an eye on him,
he said, and I agreed. Only now, as I reflect on our trek, do I realize that, despite their prevalence in the surrounding wilderness, I didn't hear a single cricket that night. Day 5. It was another brutally hot day, and I couldn't help but fixate on how strange the weather was. Not only had the forecasts promised cooler temperatures, but the bounty of shade from the trees and rocky walls of the canyon seemed to do nothing to combat the heat. Ivan appeared to be the most affected by the heat. He barely spoke. He seemed incapable of walking in a straight line, and he couldn't stop fidgeting. He rubbed his eyes incessantly, and when I suggested he keep his nasty, dirt-stained hands off of his face, he glared at me like I'd cursed his entire family. Mason seemed better off, but he too was more reserved than I'd ever seen him. At a certain point, I'd had enough of their bizarre behavior. I came to a stop a few feet in front of my friends and turned around to face them.
What's going on with you two?
It was early evening. The trees had thinned around us, and the narrow trail had opened up into a wide dirt path. To our left, in the distance, was a small, filthy-looking lake. It certainly wasn't the most scenic backdrop for a discussion, but I didn't want to put it off any longer. Mason shifted uncomfortably, looking down at the floor. Ivan, on the other hand, planted his feet firmly on the ground and glowered, visibly tensed. He looked like he was gearing up for a fight.
What are you talking about?
He said, pausing in the middle of his sentence as though the simple act of speaking was onerous to him.
I'm talking about that. The way you're speaking, the way you're walking around like you're drunk. You've just been off since the falls. If you hit your head or snorted a brain-eating amoeba, then you should have let me know.
I looked at Mason, who had always been the most level-headed of my friends, in the hopes that he'd come clean and tell me what I'd missed. Instead, I found him still staring at the ground, his eyes wide. I followed his gaze to the forest floor, and what I saw made my jaw drop. The dirt path was covered in praying mantises. Hundreds of them spilled from the woods, varied in color and size, but all marching in the same direction. For a moment, I thought that the horde was coming for my friends and me, but they didn't pay us any mind. Instead, the mantises crossed the path, continuing towards the stagnant, murky waters of the lake on the other side. Transfixed, I stood very still, knowing that one wrong step could easily crush 10 of them. Only once the last insect crossed the path did I dare to move again. I looked at my friends, who looked similarly confused, and then sighed in defeat. "Let's just go," I said, heading down the path once more. Something told me I needed to get away from that area as soon as I could. The rest of the afternoon passed in torturous silence, which I took to mean that my hiking buddies were as keen to get home as I was. We set up camp only once we were too exhausted to take another step. Ivan clambered into his tent without agreeing to a shift, so Mason and I figured we'd be on our own for the night. He agreed to take the first watch, which I greatly appreciated. Before I tucked into my sleeping bag for the night, I took some time to examine my leg. One of the veins in my lower leg had become dark and swollen. Varicosed, I think, is the right term for it. I ran a finger over the protruding vein, and then, for some reason, my calf twitched in response. I yanked my hand back in surprise. It was probably a simple muscle contraction caused by a combination of dehydration and overexertion. I left it alone after that. Somehow, after an hour of tossing and turning, I fell into an uneasy sleep. Day 5. Night. When I startled awake in the middle of the night, my clothes were soaked through with sweat. My skin felt like a heated blanket. I was half surprised there wasn't steam radiating off of me. Desperate to cool off, I wormed my way out of my sleeping bag and unzipped my tent, stepping out into the night and bumping right into Ivan, who was standing outside in nothing but his boxers. He looked as terrible as I felt. Matted hair stuck to his face, and his skin so mottled it looked like there was lace under his skin. Worst of all was his left eye, which looked as though it were bulging from its socket. I'm guessing I wasn't faring much better, because after staring at me for a minute, Ivan reached out his arm and placed it on my shoulder. He gave me what I think was supposed to be a reassuring look, and then abruptly turned away, walking away from camp. Once he'd gotten a few steps away, he turns to look at me, and I got the impression I was supposed to follow. Quickly, I slipped into my hiking boots and fell into step behind my friend as he ambled deeper into the trees. We spent about 5 minutes getting further away from camp before I came to my senses enough to ask where we were going. He didn't answer. In fact, Ivan never said anything ever again. After another few minutes, we came upon another waterfall. This one was slightly larger than Gordia Falls, but it looked strangely similar to the one that we had waded into just days prior. The plunge pool had the same shape, as did the rocky overhang at the crest. Aside from a slight difference in size, they were more or less identical, which I suspected meant one or both were artificially constructed. It was this realization that shook me from my stupor. I came to a stop, but Ivan kept walking towards the water.
Ivan, come on. Let's just go back to camp.
My appeal fell on deaf ears. He trudged his way forward, his ankles disappearing beneath the dark water. Then his legs, then his torso. Finally, he was completely submerged. Reluctantly, I inched towards the waterline. A pit formed in my stomach, growing in intensity with every second Ivan remained beneath the water. The seconds ticked by, and once several minutes had passed and he showed no indication of coming up for air, I was faced with an awful decision. Should I go in after him? As it turned out, something else made that decision for me. Something surfaced. It was Ivan, or at least Ivan's body. He was face up, his expression contorted in agony. His mouth was open in a silent scream, his cheeks marred with angry, red scratches from where he'd clawed at his skin. As I watched in horror, his eye, the one he'd been worrying all day, bulged until it was pushed clean out of his head. It dangled against the side of his face, held in place by his optic nerve, as a worm as thick as my pointer finger burst out of the bloody socket. It thrashed violently, its tan body curling and uncurling around itself. I didn't wait to see what it would do or try to take a closer look. I bolted from the falls as fast as I could, the image of my dead friend's mangled face permanently seared into my mind. There was only one thought in my head as I half ran, half hopped back to camp. That's not a vein in my leg. Mason was sleeping in his tent when I got back to camp, but I amended that quickly, charging in so fast I uprooted one of the tent poles. I shook him awake as I calmly and eloquently explained the situation to him.
Mason, Ivan is... Jesus Christ, the water, worms are crawling out of his eyes. Fuck. We gotta get out of here, like right fucking now.
Mason squinted up at me.
Ivan is, Jesus Christ?
It took me about 3 more attempts to explain what was happening, but after his initial confusion, Mason seems to believe me, especially after I showed him my leg. After learning what it was, I swore I could feel it squirming around under my skin. I tried desperately not to think about it as we shoved only the essentials into our packs and prepared to burn through the rest of the trek as quickly as we could. Day 6. For a while, we made good time. Even though my leg wasn't exactly cooperating, I was motivated by the notion that we were so close to civilization, only a day at most, and less if we hauled ass. We had no cell service and had lacked the foresight to bring satellite messengers. But every time we stopped to catch our breaths, I pulled out my phone to check for a signal to no avail. The whole canyon seems to be a dead zone. Yet another thing Ryan neglected to mention about the trail. I couldn't stop thinking about Ivan, about what he had felt in those final moments. He and I must have obtained the same parasite, though it seemed like he'd gotten unlucky. Ivan's had wormed its way into his head, maybe through his ear canal or nasal passage, whereas mine had entered through the cuts in my foot. Clearly the fact the thing was in my leg and not my head was sparing me from whatever psychological breakdown had caused Ivan to drown himself. But for how long? Would my parasite rip its way through my insides until it had reached my brain? Would I meet the same fate as Ivan if I didn't get the thing out as quickly as possible? Day 6. Evening. Every 10 minutes or so, I stopped to look at my leg. Although I knew the frequency of my check-ins were slowing us down, I couldn't help but fixate on it. The worm grew longer and thicker at an impossible rate. Every time I worked up the courage to glance down, it had grown darker, more pronounced. It hurt, but not nearly as much as I expected it to, which made me wonder if the thing was releasing some kind of numbing agent. By dusk, it had migrated upwards. One of its ends sat just below my hip bone, and the rest of its body had twisted like a spiral staircase around my leg. I considered tying one of our bungee cords around my thigh to deter the worm from moving any closer to my torso, but I doubted I could tie it tight enough, and I was concerned about cutting off my circulation for an extended time period. I knew what I had to do. The next time we stopped, I approached my friend.
Mason,
I began.
I think we just gotta cut it out.
I was fully prepared to offer my justification, but to my surprise, Mason agreed immediately. We found somewhere to sit, and I pulled the first aid kit out of my bag with shaking hands. The worm looked like it was right under my skin. As long as Mason was careful, he probably wouldn't even have to cut that deep. Just a little nick, and then he or I could grab the worm and pull it out. Easy enough, right? Mason brought the knife to my leg, and it occurred to me that I was putting my life in the hands of a man who had once gotten so drunk that he brought a raccoon into our apartment thinking it was his pet cat. He poised the blade parallel to my shin and asked me if I was ready. Can one ever truly be ready to get a parasite pulled out of their leg in the middle of the woods? I didn't think so, but I said yes anyway. I'll never forget the feeling of that knife jamming into my calf. The blade was sharp, and my adrenaline helped to numb me somewhat, but it was still, undoubtedly, the most painful thing I'd ever felt in my life. It didn't help that Mason was more heavy-handed than I expected, cutting much deeper than he needed to. After making an incision, he pulled his hand away, and I saw the worm clearly. It was identical to the tan, tube-shaped creature that had erupted from Ivan's eye socket. It writhed against exposed tissue, trying to evade capture. Mason's arm lashed out, his fingers digging into the deep laceration and curling around the worm. It slipped out of his grasp,
Twice more, he repeated the process, trying and failing to pinch the slimy, wriggling creature as it burrowed its way deeper into my leg. Remember when I said the cut was the most painful thing I'd ever experienced? I definitely lied, because having someone digging around inside of a fresh wound is 10 times worse. Thankfully, I must have briefly passed out from the pain. When I came to, Mason had finally caught the thing, and had almost finished pulling it out of my leg. The worm was unfathomably long, probably over a meter once it was straightened out. Mason yanked the last few inches out of my mangled leg, relieving me of a pressure I hadn't even realized had begun to build around my femur. Relief washed over me, but so too did disgust. I tore my eyes away from the worm to look down at my leg, and the sight of the wounds made me gag. I was losing a hell of a lot of blood.
Gauze,
I said to Mason.
pass me the gauze.
He didn't move. I looked up to find him still holding the worm in his hand. It was no longer thrashing around. One end of its tube-shaped body wrapped around his wrist, and the other end hovering in the air a few inches from his face. For no reason at all, the thing had suddenly adopted all the docility of a pet corn snake.
Dude, put that fucking thing down,
I said. Mason said nothing for a moment, and then uttered a single word.
Lost.
I thought I'd misheard him.
What?
My vision was starting to go hazy. Black dots appeared in my periphery, and I realized that I had severely overestimated my ability to bounce back from my impromptu deworming. Mason crouched down next to me, smiling. With my blurry vision, his face looked distorted, like someone had taken a smudge tool to his features.
This one got lost.
He reached his arm out towards me, bringing his hand so close that I could see the flecks of gore under his fingernails. The worm slithered down his arm towards me, its tan body stained maroon with my blood. Knowing I wouldn't be able to stand, I tried to crawl away on my hands and feet, but I was weak and sluggish, and Mason easily yanked my head back towards the worm by my hair.
Let's try this again.
The worm lunged towards me, sliding against my cheek as it made its way towards the side of my head. Just before its tapered head plunged into my ear canal, a bang tore through the woods. I felt Mason's hand release my hair, and I instantly swatted the worm off of my face. I watched my friend's body collapse onto the ground as I scrambled backwards, putting some distance between myself and the parasite. A man, decked out head to toe in hunting camo and gripping a rifle, came barreling into my view. I was fading fast from blood loss, but I raised my hands and told him not to shoot. He didn't seem all that interested in me, though, hurrying past me towards where the meter-long worm lay thrashing on the ground. The last thing I saw before I blacked out again was the man repeatedly smashing the sole of his boot against the worm, until all that remained on the dirt path was a puddle of blood. Day 7. When I woke up, my first thought was that I was in the back seat of my sister's car. The gentle undulations I felt told me I was in a moving vehicle, and the pop rock on the radio sounded just like something she would torment me with on a family road trip. When I sat up and peered into the rearview mirror, however, the face that stared back at me was that of an older man.
Good morning.
The man said, though it was still dark outside.
You have a good time, huh? We're almost to the hospital.
Lights outside the car window confirmed that we were back in this city. Thanks for the lift.
Don't mention it.
I looked down at my leg, which was now wrapped snugly in white bandages. I had a litany of questions for that stranger, probably longer than we had time for if we were nearing the end of our drive. But I started with, Mason, my friend back there, I assume he didn't make it.
Kid, what the hell do you think?
Oh, God.
What am I gonna tell his family?
And Ivan's family, too. We had another guy with us, but well, you're not gonna believe this, but he got this parasite from a place called
Gordian Falls?
Yeah.
So he knew about the falls, and he seemed to know about the worm as well. A thought occurred to me. Back on the trail, there was something following us.
Was that you? Were you the person I saw in the clearing?
Yeah.
Why were you following us?
The man laughed.
'Cause I'm a conservationist.
And you're conserving what, exactly?
Humans.
I don't get it.
The man sighed, going quiet for a minute as he seemed to consider his next words.
There's some evil shit going on in that area. And I'm not sure how you or your friends found the place, but there are forces at play in that wilderness more malignant and powerful than you know.
He caught my eye in the rearview mirror and gave me an appraising look.
You seem skeptical. Tell you what, when the police come to ask you about your missing friends, you tell them exactly what happened. You tell them about the cameras, the mantises, the falls, and the worms. They'll smile and tell you they're on the case, and then you'll never hear from them again. No one will find your friends' bodies. No one will bother to look. They'll tell everyone it was a bear attack, and you'll never hear or see a thing about Epiphany Canyon.
The car pulled into a kind of drop-off area. We were still somewhat far away from the entrance doors, but close enough that I could catch the attention of the people milling around outside for help.
Well, look at that. Here already.
The man put the car in park, though he didn't turn off the engine. He turned around to look at me, and I was surprised to see that he looked even older than I thought.
Now, you just hobble your way up the drive a little, flag someone down. They'll get you a wheelchair and have their leg fixed up or amputated in no time.
But I still have so many questions.
Get out of my car.
He said, firmly, but not unkindly. The pain in my leg outweighed my curiosity, and so I obliged, carefully getting out onto the curb. Once I closed the door to the cabin, the man rolled down his passenger's side window and called out to me.
Hey kid,
He said.
you ever heard of a horsehair worm?
I shook my head.
Parasitic worm. Lay their eggs in water, wait for insects to eat them before hatching inside their host's guts. Typical parasite stuff. But what's unusual about them is what they do to their hosts when they're ready to leave. They take full control of their hosts, even going as far as to keep the crickets from singing so they don't get eaten by another predator with the parasite still inside them. When the time comes around, they send whatever poor insect they've hijacked towards a body of water, forcing the host to drown itself. Then, the worm burrows out a hole in the insect's exoskeleton to find a mate and continue its life cycle.
In the distance, near the front doors of the hospital, a staff member seemed to take notes of the car. He gave me a tentative wave, then began walking in our direction.
Insects are pretty simple machines. Doesn't take much to puppeteer them. But what if they could take over something bigger? Something more complex? Imagine the applications of a creature like that. Something so small, so difficult to detect, yet powerful enough to control the will of a human being. Imagine what, for example, our government could do with a weapon like that. Makes you wonder, don't it?
The staff member, only a few meters away, called out, asking if we needed help. The man looked between him and I, then gave me a grin.
Well, guess that's my cue,
He said, putting the car back into drive and making a sharp U-turn. Over the squeal of his tires against the asphalt as he floored it out of the driveway, I heard him calling out.
Take care of yourself, kid.
I noticed as he drove away that there were no license plates on his car. After that, A few staff members helped me get situated inside. I was able to speak to a police officer about the incident, and as though he was understandably incredulous about my worm story, he said he'd escalate the issue. We'll see how it goes. With 2 people dead, I'd be surprised if I don't get more officers wanting to speak with me. It seems like the doctors will be able to save my leg, though it might be a while before I can walk normally again. I owe everything to the strange man from the canyon. Not just my leg, but my life. Of course, there's a good chance he is just some crazed conspiracy theorist, but so much of what he told me aligns with what I experienced in Epiphany Canyon. I have some theories of my own, of course, but I'll have to update this post later to discuss them further. One of my nurses just came in to inform me that I have a visitor. Let's see what Ryan has to say.
Thank you for listening and delving with me into the dark together.
Please remember to leave a thumbs up and subscribe if you feel so inclined. The more engagement this video gets, the more YouTube will push my content to others.
Thus, the following will grow.
All stories read in this channel will be available on Spotify, iTunes, and just about everywhere else. Links in the description.
Thank you for listening and feeding the cause. We'll be seeing you